Hi, I'm Donald Holmquest, and I am Gabriel's grandfather. Many years ago, I went to Southern Methodist University, where I became an electrical engineer. After that, I went to medical school, and then I had the opportunity to be an astronaut at NASA. While I was there, I worked on the Skylab program, but some on Apollo, including Apollo 13 and all of those missions. After NASA, I went back to practicing medicine and teaching medicine. Later, I obtained a law degree, and I practiced healthcare medicine for 15 years. And then later, I went back to being a doctor again.
All right, so my next question will be, when and how did you get involved with NASA? And what was your role at the time of Apollo 13?
When I was in medical school, trying to decide what am I going to do with the rest of my life.
How old were you?
I was probably 28. Medical school is a long thing, and I had done a PhD as well, so it had taken me a while to get out of all that training. And I had published a paper in a science magazine, which has the name Science. And somebody told me that, hey, I see that journal has been published. Have you seen your article? And I said, no. So I went to the library, checked out that volume of Science. And as I was looking through it to find what I had published, I came across an advertisement from the National Academy of Science saying we need to fly some scientists on spacecraft so that we can focus more on science, not just how to build a better spacecraft, which is what we had been doing in Mercury, in Gemini, and Apollo. And finally, we were always focused on building a better spacecraft. And they said, we need people who can be more focused on what do we learn from these flights. And they gave you a way to apply, and so I did. And if I hadn't, I would probably have ended up training my skills in Vietnam. And so I applied, and I ended up getting a letter in the mail saying you're one of the finalists, and you have to go spend a week in San Antonio at Lackland Air Force Base, and we will put you through a week of physical exams and psychiatric exams and all sorts of things to see if you might make a good astronaut. So I did that, and then I got a letter that said, okay, you're still in the finalists. You need to come to Houston and be interviewed, and you will get a flight in a airplane, which the astronauts all fly, which looks something like this. It's a two-seater, but you could fly just from the front cockpit by itself. And it goes Mach 1.4, which means you can make it from here to LA in about 25 minutes. So it goes 800 miles an hour. And so they took us all up in a flight like that to see if we were afraid of the unusual sensations that you get flying in an aircraft that may be going straight up or straight down or rolling over and over and so forth. So I ended up going through that, and I ended up being one of 11 people that were selected to go ahead and become astronauts, but included in that means you had to take a year and learn to fly that aircraft.
What was the original mission for Apollo 13, and what was the context?
Well, NASA had scheduled a number of missions to the moon. The initial one that actually went to the moon was Apollo 11, and that was in July of 1969. Then there was 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. They had hoped to have an Apollo 18, but they didn't get to do that. So Apollo 13 was the third of the lunar missions, and its mission was just like Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. Go safely to the moon, land on the moon, gather evidence of what the moon is like, how does that help us understand the universe, and so forth. And so Apollo 13 was just a mission that was longer than 12, spent more time on the moon, and otherwise it was just a normal lunar mission.
Great.
As part of that, when I first came to NASA, I was working on a much later project called Skylab, but additionally, we also helped out the guys who were working on Apollo, and I was working on some of the crew compartment issues related to Apollo, and basically just being a support person. I was not a backup crew or a support crew officially, but we were periodically given assignments to do this, do that, fly to LA, go look in a simulator, help somebody practice simulation landings on the moon and so forth. So I was a support person because I was brand new. So that's the context. And so I was there when we had Apollo 11. And then we had Apollo 12, which was a very exciting mission because while it was successful, it was hit by lightning during the launch phase and barely made it into orbit. But we salvaged that mission, went to the moon, had a very successful mission. So Apollo 13 was the next mission that we were to go on, and we would go just like the other missions, but it would stay longer, go to a more remote part of the moon, and again gather rocks and dirt and all sorts of measurements to help us understand the role the moon played in our planetary system.
And so, how were you directly involved with the Apollo 13 crisis? What did you do during the few days that they were struggling?
Well, when I was at NASA, we had about 35 astronauts who were flight qualified. I was one of those, but I was assigned to a different project that would come later than the Apollo missions. When the explosion happened on the way to the moon in Apollo 13, I was doing something else. I think I might have been in Los Angeles or at Cape Kennedy. But suddenly I got a phone call that says, get into the office as quick as you can. Everybody's showing up. We already have people on the way to Cape Kennedy to get in the simulators there. We have guys in the simulators here. And we're trying to figure out what can we do to get this mission back. Because what had happened is we had an explosion in the support rocket that basically pushed us to the moon, used propulsion to slow down enough to fall into lunar orbit, used that rocket again to push us back to Earth from the moon. And that rocket was disabled. So we were relying on the lunar module engine, one of the two engines on the landing craft. And so I was just doing whatever needed to be done. Go here, go there, go over to the simulator and help one of the astronauts over there go through various possible things that could be done to maneuver that vehicle on the way to the moon and on the way back. So I was a support person trying to help people, mainly in simulators, sometimes with the engineers looking at what we could do to reduce the CO2 in the vehicle and so forth.
So what would you say the country's reaction to the crisis was? How did, while the struggle was occurring, how did it affect your loved ones, and how did it affect your loved ones being involved with a program like NASA?
Well, initially, things changed over the course of that mission. Initially, it seemed inevitable these three guys were going to die because they wouldn't be able to get back from the moon. Because if you don't have rockets to help you steer yourself and make fine adjustments to your trajectory, you won't be able to hit the right spot on the moon in terms of orbit. So initially it was just like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do to explain this to the American public? Everybody knew this was a dangerous mission, but it's still alarming when it actually turns out to be nearly devastating. So initially we were just thinking, what do we do? Then when we realized there were mainly only one option, which was to use the lunar module engine, then we began to think, guess what? We have a possibility here that we can use a different rocket engine to do the maneuvering that's essential. This thing is already heading away from the Earth at high speed, and we have to somehow go around the moon and come back to a very precise location so we can enter the Earth's atmosphere. So as we made progress on that, our hopes went up. We began to understand the issues more carefully. We did a better job of choosing what to do next. And eventually we did exactly what had to be done. We actually entered the Earth's atmosphere. And from that point on, it was a normal mission. We had gotten rid of the rocket that didn't work. We were down to just one capsule, no lunar module, and they landed safely in the Pacific Ocean, not far from the aircraft carrier that picked them up. And I would just say for the people, the families, everybody in the astronaut corps at that time were guys. We had no women astronauts, so we had many, many wives of astronauts who were worried, what's going to happen when my husband goes to the moon or goes into orbit. And the three wives associated with the three astronauts there were obviously very, very concerned about the welfare of their husbands. But even those of us who were involved in flying this mission, I think every family member began to realize, you know what, this actually is a very dangerous mission and bad things can happen. But when that occurs, if you do everything right, you're probably going to be okay.
Why do you think the team was able to bring Apollo 13 crew home? What was the key to successfully solving the problems that they faced?
Well, one of the things being an astronaut teaches you is you have to have options to the original plan. You have to have backups. And so for the 12 months the crew was training for that mission, they were spending most of their days in flight simulators, which basically simulated that mission, the launch, the first orbit, the injection of the trajectory to the moon, and so forth. Hundreds and thousands of times, over and over again, where the guys running the simulators were playing tricks on the crew. They would make bad things happen. They would make equipment fail. They would make cameras not work, sensors not work, engines not work. So the people planning the mission to the moon actually did consider, what do we do if that engine were to fail, the one that did blow up? And in fact, when we did the Apollo 8 mission, we didn't have a lunar module on that mission, and if the same event had occurred, they wouldn't have had a spare rocket engine to get back. And so this was called the lifeboat maneuver. So when this happened, we thought, oh yes, we thought about that. We thought about what could you do, and let's go back and get our notes and look at what was the solution to that particular problem. So I think the reason they did get back is it wasn't the first time they thought about it. They'd actually planned what would happen if we lost the service module engine. We didn't spend a huge amount of time, but they did, and it wasn't a new thought to them as to how do they navigate and do course corrections when they don't have the computers in the command module. So I think that's totally why they got it back. We also had enough simulators. We had a lot of astronauts who could fly that spacecraft, who could help them understand what was the probable best solution to the mess they were in.
What do you think NASA learned from the Apollo 13 mission?
Well, I think what they learned was that all of that careful planning and practice and training was critical, in that the crew knew what to do, the people on the ground supporting them knew what they had to do. They didn't have all of the answers, but they knew how to find them. And they had hundreds of people and engineers trying to figure out what do you do without that rocket engine, without the computers that were on the command module, which was supported by that particular module. And so we had no electricity, no computers. The mid-course corrections were made using the stopwatch on your wristwatch. But they had thought about that. And so they learned to think more carefully about what do you do if those things happen. They also knew pretty quickly what part of the vehicle had failed and caused the explosion. And so, of course, they went back and looked at those. They replaced those parts. They tested them over and over thousands of times to make sure that valve didn't misoperate again. And so they learned what planning is all about and how it can save your life.
And as an astronaut, how did viewing the Apollo 13 impact your perception of space travel?
Well, we all knew, because most of the astronauts were test pilots who were flying planes that were often brand new, and things didn't always work the way they were planned. So they knew there was a high probability that something would fail. And so we had duplicates of almost every possible important piece of equipment and so forth. So I think we learned that, yes, these are very dangerous missions. And sooner or later, we're going to have some astronauts die. In fact, 3 had died getting ready for this flight in initial Apollo 1. 3 guys had a fire in the capsule while it was just sitting on the launch pad. And so we realized that, yes, bad things not only can happen, but they probably will eventually. And so all our planning after that took account of that possibility. The subsequent program to Apollo, the biggest program, was the shuttle program. And we lost 2 vehicles in there, and about 14 or 15 astronauts died. And we had sort of programmed in that there were going to be people who had their vehicle blow up or come apart, and it was just going to be considered one of the bad things that can happen, but it's inevitable. Every day in this country, there are thousands of car crashes. There's nothing we can do to make them go away. So when you're doing space flight, there are going to be accidents and explosions and problems, and some people are going to lose their life. So I think we learned that. Yes, well, when you get in a commercial airliner, you're risking your life. It turns out, though, the odds are very, very low. It's more dangerous to drive to the airport than it is to fly to another destination in the commercial aircraft. But still, people die. It's not uncommon for airplanes to crash. And so we did learn that it is very dangerous, particularly, and we plan around that.
Did Apollo 13 affect your career?
I don't think it materially affected it, except it probably cost us Apollo 18, which we didn't get to fly, and we didn't get to fly the 3 missions of the second Skylab. So that was a big negative. It was a temporary setback. It was a temporary setback, but you had a lot of people who were committed to the lunar program, and the lunar program supported the subsequent things we did. We had the Apollo-Soyuz mission, which taught us something about working with the Russians. It was a very simple mission, but we had astronauts having to learn Russian and realize that you can actually learn Russian and that you can actually work with Russians. And then Skylab taught us a lot about long-term flight. That was basically, you turn the 3rd stage into a living quarters. So you use the 1st and 2nd stage to launch and a rocket that has no fuel in it, but it's got place to sleep and place to eat. And if you go to the NASA Museum in Washington, you can go in that backup Skylab vehicle and look at it. and it taught us. The first mission was 28 days. The lunar mission was 6. 6 or 7, depending on how long we stayed on the moon. Remember, the first guys on the moon went once and were out there about 3 or 4 hours. Then the Apollo 12 maybe went out twice, and we had missions that lasted 2 and 3 days, but it's 6 to 9 days. But the second Skylab went 56 days. The third Skylab mission went 80 days. So we learned a lot about what happens to you when you're weightless for 2.5 months. Your bones don't do very well, your muscles get weak. So how do you work at staying in space a lot longer? And in the shuttle flights never got past more than about 10 or 12 days because they just didn't have enough resources on board, and that's not what they were after. But we learned a lot about staying in space a long period of time, and 13 gave us an understanding of how you build vehicles, how do you build redundancies, how do you flight plan more carefully to come up with things that unexpectedly happen. And we had these 2 tragedies with the shuttle. And today we have just seen the mission on Demo 2 that got aborted because of bad weather. And part of the reason they got aborted today is they learned with the shuttle, the Challenger disaster. When you launch in bad weather, bad things can happen.
So you would say that the Apollo 13 mission didn't really impact your career so much?
No, not really.
You'd say that, you lived through that experience, and you, after it, you were still looking forward to,
Yep.
Which, might I ask for just to confirm that what you were planning on doing at NASA ultimately was going up in space?
Yes, and didn't get to because they canceled the 3 flights that the second Skylab would have provided. They only hired enough of us to cover those 9 seats.
And so
you then ended up spending 10 or 12 years after Skylab waiting for the shuttle to be developed, because the idea of the shuttle is to have a spacecraft that you fly up, stay a while, and then you come back and land. And then you take that vehicle and you do it again and again.
Same vehicle, right.
And we went to 135 missions. And we had 2 of them that failed and killed a lot of people. But that's actually, they do a calculation of how many flights do you have to fly before you have one that fails. And it's something like 80. Before, it's still worth doing. And shuttle taught us something about that, but now you notice we've got a vehicle that has the crew on top of the rocket again, instead of like shuttle stuck on the side where debris can hit you when you're flying up, and you don't really have an abort mode off of the ground.
All right, well, thank you for your time, Mickey.
Good. How do we do on time? Unique privilege of having been the inhabitants of Earth who have been the farthest away from the Earth, because when the accident happened on the way to the moon, they didn't have the option of going into orbit around the moon, so they literally skimmed past the moon and went like 10,000 miles further before the gravity of the moon pulled them around in a 180-degree turn, and they came back toward the moon, skirted the moon, and made it all the way back to Earth. But in that passage behind the moon, they went farther away from the Earth than anybody has ever been. So that's one of the few good things that happened.
All right, so my next question will be, when and how did you get involved with NASA, and what was your role at the time of Apollo 13?
When I was in medical school, trying to decide what am I going to do with the rest of my life.
How old were you?
I was probably 28. Medical school is a long thing, and I had done a PhD as well, so it had taken me a while to get out of all that training. And I had published a paper in a science magazine which has the name Science, And somebody told me that, hey, I see that journal has been published. Have you seen your article? And I said, no. So I went to the library, checked out that volume of Science, and as I was looking through it to find what I had published, I came across an advertisement from the National Academy of Science saying we need to fly some scientists on spacecraft so that we can focus more on science, not just how to build a better spacecraft, which is what we had been doing in Mercury, in Gemini, and Apollo. And finally, we were always focused on building a better spacecraft. And they said, we need people who can be more focused on what do we learn from these flights. And they gave you a way to apply, and so I did. And if I hadn't, I would probably have ended up training my skills in Vietnam. And so I applied, and I ended up getting a letter in the mail saying you're one of the finalists, and you have to go spend a week in San Antonio at Lackland Air Force Base, and we will put you through a week of physical exams and psychiatric exams and all sorts of things to see if you might make a good astronaut. So I did that, and then I got a letter that said, okay, you're still in the finalists. You need to come to Houston and be interviewed, and you will get a flight in a airplane, which the astronauts all fly, which looks something like this. It's a two-seater, but you can fly just from the front cockpit by itself, and it goes Mach 1.4, which means you can make it from here to LA in about 25 minutes. So it goes 800 miles an hour, and so they took us all up in a flight like that to see if we were afraid of the unusual sensations that you get flying in an aircraft that may be going straight up or straight down or rolling over and over and so forth. So I ended up going through that, and I ended up being one of 11 people that were selected to go ahead and become astronauts, but included in that means you had to take a year and learn to fly that aircraft.
So you hadn't flown ever before until